The last year in gaming was an interesting one, especially for those with an eye on indies. While the big budget gamosphere was engrossed by the latest Gods of Wars and Elden Rings and the collapse of certain get-rich-quick monetization schemes, something really special was happening in the background.
Over the last 12 to 15 months or so, a certain genre seemed to experience a bit of a renaissance. A big fistful of games with choice-driven narrative elements were released in this time frame. Games made in this vein share more than a little DNA with tabletop role-playing games and choose-your-own-adventure books.
While they might shun fancy graphics and flashy action, these adventures more than make up for it with excellent storytelling, engaging player agency, and sometimes even a few fun gimmicks, like JRPG combat or dice-rolling gameplay. And we'd like to stress that while they may share some common DNA, these games are not just visual novels. Each of them features some other sort of gameplay mechanics under the hood.
So for this video, we decided to try something new and take a more conversational approach in order to show you what we appreciated about our 6 favorite narrative choice games and why each of them is well worth your time and moolah.
My name is Boss Sauce.
And I'm Roland Coons, and together,
we are the two-headed hero.
Now, many of the titles we're touching on today went to receive glowing user reviews, critical acclaim, and award nominations, but if you blinked, you might have missed some or all of these treasures. They barely registered a blip on the radars of the gaming press. So we're going to start with the most famous of these before we dig the rabbit hole even deeper. Let's take a look at Pentiment.
Yes, we know Obsidian Entertainment is a AAA studio backed by that big Microsoft money, but they've had a busy year. We've both spent a considerable, maybe embarrassingly large, amount of time building grass huts and stabbing garden insects in Grounded, the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids simulator. However, the time I spent trying to solve a string of murders in pre-Enlightenment Germany still sticks with me.
So first of all, is the game up for any awards? And the answer for that is yes. There's 4 GDC nominations, including Best Game for Pentiment, which is pretty big considering this is a game about wandering around a late medieval era German village. You play as Andreas Mahler, you're an illustrator, but the town of Tassing that the game takes place in is kind of a character itself. Like we mentioned, it takes place in 1500s era, right before the Enlightenment, and kind of when the Lutheran schism was happening in the church. So there's a lot of turmoil, and a lot of those themes are represented here.
It's a period of history that seems pretty dry and boring from the onset, right? Like, it doesn't seem very interesting for me to tell you, like, this is a game where you play as a medieval era book illustrator. That's the pitch, right? Obsidian is known for like Fallout New Vegas, right?
Basically, yeah.
Which is a game all about getting to build your own character, customize them with all these wild perks that, like, you know, a mysterious stranger appears in the middle of combat and blows someone's head off randomly. There's all this stuff going on in New Vegas that really changes the power level of your character and provides you with this fantastic power fantasy. Mm-hmm. There is none of that here.
No.
You are very slowly walking around a just barely technically an open world. You can kind of go around this little medieval village wherever you want, more or less, at different times of the day. But this is very close to a visual novel.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, it's close, but I think I would say that it is unlike a visual novel in the amount of character choice you can make.
Right.
So you do directly influence how a lot of the situations turn out, how some of the families grow throughout the course of the game, and other characters, how their situations turn out as well. And I think that's the biggest takeaway is they kind of wanted to distill that experience in Fallout New Vegas of having a big overarching 40-hour story that you can take in multiple directions and kind of put that into like an 8 or 9 hour game.
Yeah, at the end of Fallout New Vegas, all of the decisions that you've made, you kind of get like a recap of everything, and you can see like, okay, so this is how I changed my little world of the wasteland here. Mm-hmm. And Pentiment does that same thing, but compresses it and also puts it in what is actually a really kind of interesting and turbulent period of human history, like actual human history, but compared to like moving around the wasteland and stuff,
right,
it sounds a lot drier. Your character sounds a lot less interesting to play as. It's not a power fantasy. It's a really difficult pitch.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, but it's a really unique pitch on the other hand, you know?
So my experience with Pentiment was basically, I heard that it was cool and it had a really bizarre pitch, and I didn't look at anything. I just jumped into it and then got to be consistently surprised by what this game actually was. And I think that that's kind of the ideal experience, so I don't really want to take that away from people.
So, like, over the course of this game, like we were saying, you watch the same characters and families grow old and have kids, and they face their own trials and hardships, like during a famine or when they're getting taxed to a ridiculous degree and can barely scrape by. The elder people in the village sometimes will grow old or die. You get to see tragic things. Like, this story has incredibly sad moments to it. It gets real. Like, it's Middle Ages level miserable in a lot of areas. We're talking, like, trigger warning for kid deaths and starving families and loss of a parent kind of stuff. It's heavy, but it does have moments of comedy as well. Other moments that are lighthearted or dreamlike, you know, fantastical elements. And going back to the history part, there's a really cool sense of history where you find out that the town is built on Roman ruins very early on. There's this overwhelming, like, sense of oldness to the whole thing. And exploring some of those ruins and older places in the game and forests and things like that, I think that was probably some of my favorite parts. Moving on to the mechanical parts of the game, it does have familiarity. It plays really well with the controller, but it plays like a point-and-click adventure game. There's equal parts exploring the village and its surrounding areas and talking, but there's no inventory at all. It does have a lot in common with a visual novel in that regard, but there's still gameplay elements involved here. You had a different experience with this than me, but there's a convince mechanic. I could not, for the life of me, convince anyone in the story to do anything.
Just can't convince anyone to do anything.
Yeah.
The way that the convince mechanic works is there are a bunch of, call them tags or something like that, that are paying attention to a bunch of different things happening behind the scenes for specific, you are making a choice or kind of failing or passing a event. And they're different for every event, but you can invest early on, like you get to pick all of your perks and things for your character, but they're things like, I am from Italy, so I can speak a little Italian, and or like, I know a lot about logic, or I can read Latin.
I know a lot about partying. That one's one of my favorites.
Know a lot about partying, you know, all kinds of different stuff. So one of the really common ones, like you could get a bump when attempting to convince someone of something, those kind of conversations, which is most of them that change things. So you could pick like, I'm a good orator, right? Like I'm very good at convincing people of stuff, and just like get a certain points increase on that conversation. All that does really is give you kind of like a little buffer and make it slightly easier to pass these conversations, because you don't have to do every single thing right in all of the different little dialogue choices. How the rest of the system works is you will listen to this character talk for a little bit. As an aside, it's very charming because every character has a font that matches their place in society. For example, the typesetter of the village has a like hand typeset font and sounds like little wood blocks.
A printing press, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a printing press. Whereas a monk that's very good at cursive, good at calligraphy, will have like a long, beautiful, flowing font for their words and sound like.
It'll sound like scribbling.
You read a block of what this character has to tell you, and then you are presented with a number of choices. And you really have to think a lot yourself about what are you trying to convince this character of? Are they even going to like you attempting to convince them? Or should you completely back off? For example, you're talking to a nun and you're trying to convince them to let you borrow a book. You can be good at theology and logic, and you can like argue convincingly against some of this nun's beliefs, but doing so is not going to get you that book, even though you're good at that stuff. So it doesn't work like in a lot of these classic computer RPG style, where if you have, you know, roguery as one of your perks or whatever, it just like unlocks some character conversations, right? Or all the BioWare stuff, like Mass Effect.
Like a base skill check kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah. It's just like, do I have this thing? Check. Oh, so then I do have this dialogue option, which will provide me with a bonus. And that is my reward for choosing this perk. No, that is not here. You still have to think a lot about what you say to every one of these people. And if you go through this whole conversation and you make a couple of bad choices, you will not be able to pass it. You will not get to go down that path. And
Well, hold on. You did also bring up to me that this game does have a buried save scum.
yes, you can save scum.
But I played it without any scumming. I played it all the way through and just lived with my choices because I did not know this. And I think that the game experience was better for it because of that.
Absolutely. I don't think save scumming is a positive experience here because it breaks the illusion that you are crafting a history for this little town. Like, it doesn't actually matter how your story turns out in the end, just that you can feel that you affected it and that it became your story. That's the magic of this game.
Yes, definitely. Another thing I want to add is mechanically, it is separated from a visual novel because there's a strict time management mechanic at play here. So you won't have the time to do everything in the game that you want to do. You'll have to make choices to do like 1 or 2 big things every day. Some of these are punctuated by some of my favorite parts of the presentation, which were these little kind of vignettes where you're having a meal with someone. So you choose who you want to have breakfast or lunch with or whatever, and there's a period appropriate meal that's put in front of you, and all of them look like tasty video game food. Even though sometimes it's like, I'm eating bread soup with this peasant, or I'm eating crazy, apples and fancy cheese and wine with this noble.
Lots of tiny bowls of nuts.
Almonds. Delicious looking almonds. I really liked that part because it also helped you learn the characters. It helped you learn their motivations, their beliefs, what they were afraid of. So it really made the whole village feel like the main character. It made it come alive. And Andreas, in comparison, while he does have a character arc himself, he's kind of almost like in the background a lot of the time when you're confronted with all these, medieval people and how they would live their lives and what they would think about. And I think people want to like simplify that so much. And we see a lot of high fantasy stuff where they're just like, oh, the simple peasantry, but these were complex people with intelligent takes on their own societies and stuff like that, and they didn't all believe the same thing, and they knew that there were other people of other beliefs outside of their little sphere, and I think that's something that's not really well explored in video games in general. So this was really cool to see.
Yeah, well, I mean, we were talking about the meals. That's part of what makes this game feel so cozy at times. I'm actually going to argue against that this game is highly replayable. I loved my first experience with it. I went back to play with the mechanics and see how much choice there actually was. And there are branches in this game. You do get to affect the village a lot. It is very cool. I feel like it shattered the illusion a little bit for me because there's not as much freedom as you feel there is the first time through.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. You lose some of the sense of wonder for sure, yeah. Okay.
This is like a really wonderful 8-hour, 12-hour game. And I think that's what they tried to make it, and I think they were really successful with it. It's my game of last year, almost.
I mean, we could go all day on this stuff, but I feel like we should maybe start talking about the other things that make this stand out, like its presentation.
We haven't mentioned the way that this game looks, because I assume that there's some video of how it looks while we're talking.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm saying there's a few things that struck me. Like, there's those illustration and book sequences in the beginning, in the first chapter especially, where you're basically reading a book and someone is talking to you about the book, and slowly the pages get filled in with these gorgeous drawings. And everything in the game kind of looks like gorgeous medieval manuscripts, which is a really cool art style that you don't see super often.
Yeah, it's very unique. You can zoom out of a scene at any time, and it brings you to this very useful glossary of terms. So, a nun will drop some obscure scripture on you, and you can kind of back out of that and be like, okay, what is she talking about exactly? Or who is Luther? What actually is going on in this period of human history?
Yeah.
But when you zoom out, you get the illusion that the scene itself is an illustration in this book that you are reading/writing, perhaps. So I just think that is a really nice touch that kind of brought me into the whole thing.
There's some other minor details that I felt like were definitely there for the internet views. Like, you can pet every single animal in the game. So I'm like, okay, that's there for Reddit and for Twitter to be like a gif of petting the dog. Okay, neat. And, you know, I like it, but at this point I almost feel like people arbitrarily put that in for marketing. The music is the one thing where I felt like they really went over the top. They have all this period perfect music with great instrumentation, Gregorian monk chants, Polish folk songs, stuff like that. Really, really cool, and it's all in the native languages. Delightful to listen to, I thought. This is not one that I watched a TV show next to. I actually, like, straight up just played the game and experienced it by itself because it was that enjoyable to hear as well as see.
Right away with the Roman ruins, they kind of give you little hints of mythological creatures and stuff. Like, is this actually human history? Is there a touch of mythology here? Throughout the whole game, there is that sense of foreboding of like, oh, something actually a bit darker and more magical is going on here. And I'm not going to tell you how that turns out because I think that would be a spoiler. But they introduced that really early on, and I think that's a great tonal choice.
So all in all, would you say that this is a good example of a narrative choice adventure game in the brackets that we're trying to describe it in? Why or why not? To review that one more time, we're talking about games that have gameplay components, but are also filled with narrative choice.
I mean, I think we've already said, like, yes, this one's a good one. You get to make a lot of character choices here, and you get to make a lot of decisions about what's going to happen to this community. And kind of create your own sense of history, and it really gives you that illusion.
So I would say it is a pretty good example of that. It is more of a traditional adventure, so it's more of like the BioWare choices matter, in quotes, when it comes to player agency. But it's still really well written, it's a compelling story, it's original feeling, and a very cool experience in its own right. So moving on to Norco. This was one of my favorites out of the list as far as a storyline goes. I'm not sure if it's the most narrative choicey game on the list, but there is some branching paths. This is also the game that won the first ever games category at the 2022 Tribeca Film Festival, and it was also nominated for a bunch of other awards in narrative categories. So the writing on this game definitely stands out. Norco is basically a first-person adventure game with mild RPG elements that opens with a brief recent history of the lead character named Kay, who's returning to their hometown, which is a decaying refinery town called Norco, Louisiana, after the death of a parent. Their brother Blake is really forlorn, and as soon as you get back, you find that he is nowhere to be found as well. So you get the feeling that something bad has happened to your family. The mystery ensues.
Yeah, so what do we talk about first with this one? The strongest part of this game is its tone, which is, compared to Pentiment, Norco is a lot more playful cyberpunk shoegaze.
I think playful cyberpunk shoegaze psychedelia I will add to the end of that.
Yeah.
There's so many surreal elements to Norco, both in the writing, the dialogues, and the visuals themselves.
It verges on that magical realism feeling, but then it just goes full magical, I guess, at some points, which is great. I would be upset if it didn't, I think. Like, the best part of this game for me is the chapter 2 reveal, I want to say.
So the mom character, Catherine, is a researcher. You find this out in the very first 10 minutes of the game. And near the end of her life, she was hired by a client in Fat City of unknown name or origin to look into reports of illegal construction by a big oil company called Shell Oil that owns half the town. So she was in the swamp looking for something for an unknown client, and that's a big chunk of the mystery. And then you have the mystery of also what happened to your brother, and what was Shell Oil looking for. And so it kind of like hits you right in the face right away with a whole bunch of big questions, you know, kind of expects you to just go for it and just start figuring stuff out. There's a whole bunch of other little details in between this. Like there's a mysterious kind of cryptocurrency app called Quack that a lot of people are using, where you get a random gig task, kind of like an Uber or, you know, Grubhub or something, but for random tasks.
That's the main thread of the mom chapters. Like, that's the framework of the story for the mom chapters is like,
yes,
you are doing this thing
yes,
to try to make money because you need to pay off your medical bills before you die, which is so grim It's like sad
and realistic. Yeah.
and realistic. But then like the game will just consistently surprise you in a fun, like whimsical way. You know, like the writing is really funny. And it's not afraid to just do these hairpin turns in tone.
Right.
Like this game still feels cozy as Pentiment in places, even though it also veers into this epic cyberpunk kind of shit too, you know?
As this game is structured, it is way more similar to a VN than Pentiment, I would say even. It feels like there's a linear progression. There are some branching choices you can make to affect the ending, and there are 3 separate endings. They do come up late, and there are some middle choices that you can do that will affect some of your relationships with the characters. But none of them seem super impactful towards those 3 endings. They are very funny though. So like, for example, one of my favorite things was the game mechanics. I know you skipped out on the combat completely. I feel like that was a mistake. There's active time JRPG combat in this game where you basically have to do little challenges, like you do a Simon Says version, and then there's a just click the thing in the right time version of the combat and make choices and heal your guys, you know? So it's really simplified. I really liked it. I thought it was super fun, and the visuals for it were awesome. The monkey combat tutorial in the very beginning introduces you to this, and I love how you have a stare down with a stuffed animal as the intro to your combat. And then there's a secondary kind of tutorial where it's the first encounter that's for real, but it's also really basically a tutorial where you kind of beat down this bully's ass with your sock monkey. I loved it. I loved it so much, where it's just got like an unnerving stare. And that's how it attacks.
I actually really appreciated, as an accessibility option, you can just turn the combat off, though. If you want to just completely bow out of that whole portion of the game, like you don't want to click buttons fast, maybe you're just not feeling that, it's totally fine.
I will also say another cool accessibility move, this game played equally well with a controller or a mouse. So that's a big plus. Very couch-friendly experience as well.
I mean, if we're gonna grade the narrative choice mechanics on this game, I don't think there's a lot of choice in this game.
Not generally, no.
The mechanic that I really did appreciate that was somewhat unique was the mind map of memories that you can go into.
Yes.
There's a separate menu. You know those serial killer, like try to find the serial killer boards where there's a bunch of strings connecting everything?
A Pepe Sylvia.
Kind of looks like one of those. You can think about any of the characters, places, concepts that you've already unlocked, like you've already discovered in the story.
Yeah.
And doing so can kind of give you more information about the things that it's connected to, or even unlock new concepts. Like you can think about some stuff and then you remember the Ditch Man for the first time, and then later on you're encountering this character that you just encountered in your memory first, that's really interesting.
I really liked how it reminded me of Disco Elysium.
Well, you fucking stepped on exactly what I was gonna say. Yeah, but no, you're right. Yeah, Disco Elysium is the thing that comes to mind immediately there.
The Thought Cabinet.
So that was cool. That part, I think, was the biggest, like, mechanical draw. Of course, presentation-wise, it's very pretty. The pixel art is done really well. It's a unique setting. You just don't see...
Set in New Orleans, too. Like, there's not a lot of games set in New Orleans. The sound was awesome. It had this really appropriate kind of Amiga-era soundtrack that was all MIDI tracker sounding. But the writing, that was the standout for me. I think the way the characters were written, the way they talked to each other, it was dark but funny and bizarre and brilliant. The descriptions. You pick up a book that says don't be a vampire, and it has little nuggets of wisdom like being inside all the time is bad for your skin, but blood tastes like bong water, so it's not very glorious to be a vampire. Like, that shit was really funny. I loved it. And the physical descriptions of all the characters. That was the last thing I was going to mention. The way they physically described the characters, they named them by some random physical attribute they had. So there'd be a guy called Baseball Cap, or Round Glasses, or Sketchy Santa. You know, like, that was an excellent touch. It really added to the whole surrealist atmosphere where that's that guy's defining feature in the story. And it also helped you pick apart who's important to the story versus who's not.
The power of Norco is definitely vibes, right? Like, the thing that it nails is it is completely unique, very compelling, just in its like setup and setting. And I guess that also, this is another game that's kind of a hard pitch. It's so hard to go, story first. Like the nuances of Norco are what are unique and powerful about it.
My general takeaway for this is it's a bit of a departure from the rest of the list even, but it's somewhere between like a short JRPG and like one of those old Mac Venture games that tried to put a very linear adventure game in with some timed combat. Very simple inventory management and very simple dialogue puzzles, but it's very memorable. In my opinion, like this was a really memorable game. Mind map feature that we already talked about definitely rounds it out. And maybe it doesn't provide the best example of a heavy narrative choice or player agency game, but it's still one of the ones that's sticking with me for the whole year. So moving on to Beacon Pines. I think this one is the most interesting interpretation of a narrative choice game because choosing the narrative is literally the core game mechanic of Beacon Pines. This one is actually up for just one award that I could find. It's the Shack News Best Narrative Game 2022 award. It seemed more under the radar than the other games on the list, but I kind of want to bring it forward because it is something I fully did not expect to enjoy. It's got all of these components that usually are not my thing. It's furry-centric characters.
Oh, yeah.
With a narrative game.
Yeah, we got furries.
Presented in a storybook fashion that takes place in a small town after an abysmally poor agricultural year that is known in-game as the Foul Harvest.
Not only are they furries, but they're also beautifully illustrated, but like very cute.
Yeah.
Very cutesy. It's kind of like...
you got Disney characters going on here.
Yeah, a Disney artist with, Charlie Brown proportions on a furry JRPG project. Like this is kind of what you would come out with. That is not an insult.
No, it's just not my vibe usually.
It's incredibly well done. The illustrations are amazing. Like this game looks beautiful.
I agree, it's a beautiful game.
Yeah.
If I saw only screenshots of this game and someone's like, do you want to play this? I would be like, pass. I got down to it, and then I found out in the first 10 minutes, I was like, oh, I don't know, man. Because you're playing a little kid who's standing over his dad's grave at the very beginning. And I'm like, oh, it's going to be like a Bambi. And then you find out your mom is missing, so your objective is find the mom. And like we were saying, it did not grab me at first with its hook or its presentation, but really early on, like 20 minutes in, you meet a few other characters, and you find yourself stumbling upon a toxic experiment deep in the woods with a dead body, mysterious radio transmissions, hints of a vast X-Files conspiracy. And that's where I got sucked in. That's where I was like, okay, you got a Scooby-Doo going on here.
Yeah.
I am here for it.
The story picks up quickly.
So the main thing that makes this one unique is the turning point approach to the narrative structure. Basically how it works is you go through the environment or through certain situations, you find these things called description badges that can be used to end a sentence in the storybook in different ways. And I did see this approach in a previous game that you haven't played called Chernobylite, which is kind of a mix between Stalker and Tarkov. But the main hook of Chernobylite is there's this mysterious green crystal that's growing out of the Chernobyl ruins, allows you to create branching universes, basically. You time travel. So you can go back to these touch points. It's like a nexus of choices that you can make, and you make different ones, and the narrative progresses based on the ones you make. And some of these branches in Beacon Pines can go really long. Like, they go far out there before you realize that, okay, the story has played out in this way. And you can just accept that as your ending if you want. You can just be like, that's cool. I like the way that ended. It wasn't the best ending, and it wasn't the final ending.
Right.
Credits didn't roll, but it was still cool.
The narrator always encourages you with a little bit of like, well, that could have gone better though, don't you think? Wink, wink. Oh, hey, it looks like you unlocked a new tag that you could try somewhere else. Wink, wink. But the thing about Beacon Pines is that you will eventually make every choice, right? So
right.
The only thing you're actually choosing is what order that you're making the choices in. However, I still think just the fact that instead of having a branching path where you only get to see the path along the choices you've made, which is the normal structure for this kind of thing. Instead of doing that, they've turned it into this like fractal tree that you uncover every corner of. I think that's the unique part of the game. So you're not building your own story, you're experiencing their story in a non-linear fashion. I think it is the closest to a visual novel that we have on this list, actually even closer than Norco, because Norco does have branching endings, even though it branches right at the end. But there's still something unique about this game, and the presentation is still worthwhile.
We touched on the visuals, but there's also a really good music score here with haunting piano-driven riffs that are heavy on atmosphere and mystery that really drive that Scooby-Doo vibe home. The controller-based support is excellent in this game. I played the whole thing through with a controller. I tried mouse and keyboard, and it just did not feel as tactile or nice.
Absolutely.
It feels like it was made for a controller. There's a jump button. Jump button always in a third-person game. I love having a jump button just to give you something to do when you're walking around. There's quality voice acting from the narrator, but I feel like I wish you could turn it off. I wish you could turn off the narrator because none of the other characters are voiced in the entire game. And it feels like a little discordant.
It made the whole thing feel like it was voiced over. Like it upped the production values of the entire thing. And I kind of think like the best magic trick that Beacon Pines does is it is like so scrappy as far as its production levels go.
It punches high.
It punches high. And it does that by, like, instead of having to make a bunch of branches, a bunch of extra branches that only some players are going to hit, you have to hit every branch to see the ending, the real ending of this game.
Man, this story, without spoiling anything about the game, it takes some turns. Like, some of these narrative branches you'll chase down are extremely fulfilling, and not all of them feel like a Disney movie, we'll put it that way. It gets grim in some parts and weird and spooky. So I love it. While it does have a branching choice mechanic, you kind of have to chase every one of those branches down to its conclusion.
We have had the same experience, although slightly in a different order.
I see your struggle, where you're struggling to say this is like a narrative choice game, but I tend to think of it more of as a choose your own adventure book, like an old school choose your own adventure book from the 80s, where you've got your fingers as bookmarks in multiple places so you can go back and read and make a different choice.
Yeah, I like that.
The next one up on our list is Citizen Sleeper. Oh man, this one was a tough one to be like, okay, is this the best or second best or third best? It's another one that I was like, it looks like a board game, plays like more than a board game, and I really got into it. This is a cyberpunk role-playing dice game. You wake up in a robot body, remembering nothing. You don't own the body, it's leased, and you're on a deteriorating space station. So your corpo property, bounty hunters are after your ass, and the DRM on your stupid body causes you to rapidly degrade. So in order to fully embrace your new life, you've got to find a way off of the station to try to, capitalize on that new life, or you've got to find a way to put down roots and live out the rest of your days in secrecy.
Let's talk about the visuals first. It gives you a low poly 3D look at this circular, like, orbital space station. It feels very much like a board game in a way. Everything is flat.
It feels like a map.
It feels like a map. It is a map. Layered on top of that are these really beautiful character illustrations, and I think that presentation mirrors the feeling of the game.
I would say that the portraiture, not only does it have a very unique style, it kind of plays off of the expectation of a visual novel where you're going to have like the close-up of the person with the reaction face or whatever, but it subverts that by having just its own really unique comic booky style to it.
Well, as far as the portraiture goes, I don't just mean like the literal portraiture, but like, you're in this very dehumanizing cyberpunk universe. Like, you are a cast off of a corporation that is dying, but you're still sentient, and you're like a cast off slave, essentially. It's really fucking grim. But then the whole game, you are meeting these people and you're having these really lovely human moments with them if you follow that path to do so. It's another comfy, cozy game, even though the overarching themes are really grim.
So while you do have that comfy, cozy feeling, you're constantly scrambling for survival because of your body degrading every day, and also you still need to figure out how you're going to feed yourself. You have these tools at your disposal, so every day when you wake up, the game gives you an amount of dice based on the condition of your body, and that dictates what you'll be able to do that day, or at least attempt to do. Depending on your stats that you choose at the beginning, you can maybe lean more into cutting up spaceships and scrapping stuff. You can lean more into hacking, because there's an entire hacking game, like a sub-game, that you can use to find data and sell it off to the corporations, basically playing them off each other.
Not just like a mini game, it is actually another layer to the entire map. So you can more or less ignore the hacking stuff if you want, but you can also like completely go into the cyberspace realm of this space station and just do that part if you want.
Well, you won't be able to progress the story just living in cyberspace, but you can get by. You can feed yourself and survive just doing the cyberspace stuff.
There are endings that you get by pursuing the cyber stuff more. You can take that whole path, or you could kind of do everything. When we say you can do everything, you can get right up to the very end of any of these paths and then decide not to do that one and go and do a different one and get all the way up to the very end of that one, decide not to go do that one and go do a different one.
So I would say that this feels more like a role-playing game in general, and the interactions and vignettes you have of the various characters reflect that and enforce it, especially when going to the more human elements that you were describing earlier, where you have these very human interactions. Like, you can help out this old man that's got debt. That's like the first kind of quest the game throws in your way. And in exchange, he's given you a shipping container to sleep in. So you can try to help him out with his thing. And similar to Pentiment, you are actually changing the lives of the people, which are just as powerful characters as you yourself are. So I think that was a really cool approach to this kind of game. And it does feel board gamey, it does feel gamey in general, but it also feels very fulfilling.
Yeah, I think so too. You make a lot of character choices that are more about who you want to be. Much more so than Pentiment. I mean, Pentiment has some of that. Definitely, I would say that the main mechanic of Pentiment is that. The choices are who you want to be, what you want to have happen to this little town. And that's similar here, but because of the structure of the game, Citizen Sleeper fits so many more choices in. Like, so many more.
There's also a new DLC for this one as well, meaning there's a reason to come back to it, even if you've already finished it. This one's also on Game Pass. Totally worth your weekend playing this one. And I would say that there's a little more meat on the bone here than most of the other titles on this list. Let's move on to Roadwarden, which I believe is your pick. So this game is actually up for Edge Magazine PC's Game of the Year, and it also has 3 honorable mentions for IGF. So that's pretty big. There's a lot of heavy hitter narrative games that got an IGF nomination this year, and this game deserves it by far. It is really, really good. You take on the role of the Roadwarden. You're kind of a combat-trained highway patrolman, and you travel around and attempt to help settlements with their issues. Your task in this particular game is survey the peninsula for Holovan, which is a neighboring nation that, while recently under the threat of a giant war and kind of in a reclamation and recovery period, they now wish to open trade routes with the inhabitants of this land. So you have a 40-day time limit to do as much good you can in this regard, and try to make it amenable to trade from another country as much as possible by interacting with local village leaders and so forth.
Okay, so the format of this actual game, it is mostly text-based. This feels like wizardry almost. It feels like a very, old school. You see a image of a setting, you read a description of the setting, and you have a whole bunch of verb choices about what to do, and you have like an inventory that you build up. You have a character that you're building and making like role-playing game style, like tabletop RPG style character choices for, to like advance them and become a little bit more powerful. You never feel super powerful in this game.
Like a family of badgers can kill you.
Everything can really kill you. Yeah, you can get killed by most everything, like just walking around in these woods. They're very dangerous.
So much can go wrong, and on top of this, there's a 40-day time limit to the entire game, which is apparently optional. You can turn that off and just experience the story.
So that was well appreciated, but you can kind of increase your awareness of the world and learn about it, and that combined with this slow uptake of resource gathering that you do and like ability gathering that you do does make you feel more powerful. Like there is a power curve in this game.
Every choice feels really impactful, and survival is center stage, so Citizen Sleeper has a lot in common with this game, but I feel like Roadwarden is more dangerous feeling in a lot of ways because you can't see your dice rolls. They're invisible, which is really interesting. And in my opinion, it's kind of like a DM rolling the dice for you behind a curtain, which I love.
Right away, this game gives you lots of character choices just directly. Like, you get to pick your character class. It's not even very standard because your character options are basically warrior, magic guy, or alchemist, right? So you have like your third character choice is like you can read and write and you can make potions. It's much more applicable than that sounds, but when you put it up against either warrior, which is like you're constantly fighting wild animals and stuff, or wizard, where you like have this whole other branch of ways to solve problems, like the alchemy one is so interesting. Like, it's such an interesting texture to put in the game.
The alchemy one was interesting because as I traveled through the lands as an alchemist, I started to realize where my talents would come in handy, but I was unable to actuate those talents because you have to find the ingredients. So like there's a part where there's a bridge, and this bridge is swarmed with insects. And so you're like, logically, if I make these insects go away, that's going to open up a trade route. That's going to be moving towards my final goal as a Roadwarden here. But you have to like ride through it, which is dangerous because your horse could freak out and stuff. You know, like you get scared and you have to like bundle yourself up so only your eyeballs are showing and try to ride through this cloud, like solid black cloud of bugs. But you can also make an insect repellent later on to go and get rid of that particular hurdle and open up the path. So like you're full of these little point and click adventure things like this where you're like, I know what I have to do, but I have to find the means of doing it.
There are a lot of kind of roadblocks on your highway, but you can also always just go all the way back around because it's a big circle. But that's gonna like cost you a bunch of time, and then there are some shortcuts that you can kind of unlock that will make that cost less time, but they're dangerous, you know. So there's a little bit more wiggle room there than a straight linear adventure game, right? The other thing that I wanted to talk about as far as building your character and character choice goes, because that's where we started here, is right away you get to pick not only your class but your religion, like how you feel about religion, your background kind of, which comes into play over and over again. There are certain villages that will look more kindly upon one viewpoint. There are certain ones that will look more kindly on the other. It is like this instant character choice that you can make that is extremely impactful, which is really cool. And even more impactful, I found, was beyond all that, you also get to immediately choose your character's life goal, right? So you have this
you have a motivation.
You have a motivation, which is such an obvious thing to include in this style of game because it's the biggest missing piece of the puzzle as far as turning a tabletop role-playing game experience into a computer role-playing game. And I've never seen it before.
I think that makes the character feel well-rounded, and I've never seen it before either. Yeah, exactly.
And it's not just flavor. You're not just picking a background like, I'm a pirate also, and I'm the savior of the world, and I'm also a pirate. Arr. You know, like, it's not just that.
Maybe you want to retire in the countryside.
Yeah, maybe you want to sort of get a fresh start. Maybe you want to find a family. You know, beyond just having a flavor, there are a lot of, well, I mean, there are several points in Roadwarden where you get to, like, think about how the decision, the, like, turning point that you are at would affect your ability to reach your own personal life goals. And you get to weigh it against what you're doing to the other virtual people that are involved in the situation. And that is actual fucking role-playing, which, I mean, all these other games are like edging up to this feeling, but this is my game of the year because it got there. It actually got to the point where I felt like I was making role-playing decisions, like inhabiting an actual character.
I think the clicking moment for me was when it dawns on you that the primary task is to make the peninsula and its people more attractive for Hollivan's trade deal. And it allows you to not only paint your own motivations in many different ways of your choosing, but also portraying the history of Hollivan with your choices narratively.
As opposed to Norco, where like those choices, like you're making those character choices, but it's kind of just for you. It's just like, oh, and now you get to feel this way about that character or that situation. In Roadwarden, there's a payoff because there's an epilogue where whatever, we're doing spoilers for all these games. This isn't that much of a spoiler. There's an epilogue where you go back to your original country and you get to see that all those like dream state choices that you made changed this country in your reality. So yeah, it's really very cool. This was mostly a single developer, which is indie as fuck. This is a huge accomplishment. This guy actually is like pushing game design forward just by himself.
I want to say a couple things about the presentation. First of all, they don't really use a lot of graphics. There's little pixel arty, Amiga-styled isometric pictures, and that's what they do for the game's visuals. And I think it serves as kind of like a DM map. Like, this guy obviously understands tabletop. So this serves kind of like as a DM map where you're saying you're in this location, here's what you're doing, here's what you see, and you're looking around as if you're a player character. One other thing I think was really great about the presentation was the use of language. They do some interesting things here. So the horses are considered as monsters by some of the townsfolk, for example. Like, they've never seen a horse. They're like, I don't trust that demon. You know, why are you riding around on this weird monster? Bodies are also not as important, I guess, spiritually in the belief system that's present here, because they're referred to as shells. So you get this feeling that spiritualism is really important in the peninsula because of the way that characters will refer offhandedly to things, which is great because the player then has to infer to these things through context or through using the glossary and so forth. This is probably the narrative choice game that had the most meat on the bone out of all of these games, not only in length but in depth and replayability. You're gonna feel like you're barely holding on to your life, and each choice feels like it's really impactful and filled with peril. And while it's not like super fancy looking or visually stunning, the aesthetic works together to make you feel like you're having this cozy tabletop session. And it does a great job of making you feel like a tiny part of this overarching dangerous land. And it's totally worth it. I think it's $12 on Steam, which is basically nothing.
And also, one of the first major patches was a Steam Deck compatibility patch. So if you're looking for like a really great, essentially game book, but one that has that old school tabletop vibe to it. If you're like missing role playing in your life, Roadwarden is such a good fit for that.
It will fill the gap.
Yeah.
Yeah. So finally, we have Betrayal at Club Low. Now, we've done an entire review on Betrayal at Club Low, and that is going to be linked in the description for you. But since we covered it, we have found out that this pizza game is up for 3 IGF noms for Excellent in Design and the Nouveau Award, which basically celebrates games that make the jurors think differently about games as a medium. That just kind of attests to the uniqueness of Betrayal at Club Low. Basically, it just puts you under the pizza hat of a secret agent that's skilled in the ways of the pizzioli, and you are supposed to infiltrate a club using only the power of pizza and a variety of upgradable dice, and rescue a fellow agent before his cover is blown, in a very weird, absurdist, replayable, short adventure.
As we've said, we've already done a full review on it, but the Cliff's Notes of what makes this thing stand out, it's got this very, like, found object sculpture style, art style.
It feels like a collage.
It essentially feels like a bunch of Unity assets that were glued together into these bizarre surrealistic sculptures, right? Like the entire game feels that way. It hangs together really well, and it also almost feels like the Grim Fandango world in a way to me.
Yeah, with very exaggerated angles, and like you've got Dutch angle views on some of the rooms and stuff like that. And the other thing that is very interesting is this game's presentation loops into all the other games made by Cosmo D, the guy who developed the game. So he's doing basically what Remedy is doing with Alan Wake and Control and Max Payne, and making them all kind of part of one universe, which is really, really cool. I love to see it.
It also lets him reuse assets, like repurpose assets in different ways.
Smart.
I think that,
Yeah, very smart.
Yeah, as far as scrappy indie outfits goes, that's another real appreciated high benchmark.
So this is another one where it's extremely gamified. It leans on dice mechanics very heavily. Basically, you choose your initial skill build and then upgrade the faces of your dice with pizza money that you earn from succeeding via game challenges and encounters. You get pizza tips, you upgrade dice, you upgrade pizza dice by finding pizza toppings, and these two kind of gel together to making a character build. So this one does feel just as gamified as something like Citizen Sleeper, in my opinion, but it really works together super well.
If this was a board game, I would put it in the genre of dice building and dice mitigation.
Yeah, for sure. Outside of combat, it works like a standard point and click. You just point and click around on stuff and click to talk to people, and there's definitely some dialogue trees and stuff like that, but you'll see at the end of each of your choices, there's a little indicator as to what skill you can use to convince them to perform an action or convince them that your way of thinking is the correct one, and further advance your goal into infiltrating the club and saving your buddy Gemini J from certain doom. It's really cool. There's a lot of different approaches. There's like 11 endings, I believe. And the writing itself is stellar. It's strange, funny, ton of unexpected turns and twists, and it kind of just builds upon itself to become its own self-referential, unique, fantastical vibe. It's amazing.
The tone of Betrayal at Club Low, like the main thing that it's trying to get across is just a stream of consciousness, absurdist humor, I think. You know? Like that, it's a comedy game. It's about comedy, and it just happens to also have some really interesting mechanics going along with it as the backbone.
Yeah, this one is my personal pick for the game that embodies the spirit of narrative choice adventure the most.
To its credit, Betrayal at Club Low does not have, it's not the balloon animal structure at all. You just branch. It just branches, yes, and then it's done.
Yes.
So each of these playthroughs can only be, 2 hours long?
Yeah, at the most.
Something like that. But then you get all these endings. See, there's like 13 endings or whatever. So you try to get all the endings. You kind of like Beacon Pines in a way, but there's some actual like mechanics that you have to puzzle out.
In a way, but
yeah,
the journey is so fulfilling in this one, because that feeling of success and when the dice are going your way, and when you make a clever move to outwit your opponent or get lucky and snatch one of their dice away. I don't know. I had the most fun, like just overall joy with this one.
The way that its structure succeeds a little bit more than Beacon Pines is that you can just play it once or twice. It doesn't present one of the endings as the real ending and make you go through everything. It's like any one of the endings that you get, and you could get basically any of them the first time through, I think. Any one of those endings can just be your real ending. And then you can throw out the rest of this game if you want to, which is, I mean,
that's kind of nice, where you can put as much or as little as you want to into the game. It's definitely the one I enjoyed the most overall. And check out our review. Honestly, we go deep on this one, so go ahead and take a look at that other video.
I suppose we can talk about that some more in the past.
Yeah, go time travel to past us and look at that video. It's still sitting there. So, just recap which one's our favorite.
You should see them all. They're all great.
Exactly.
None of them take up more time than they're worth. I think in the case of Roadwarden, that is a game that has done something unique.
The value proposition for Roadwarden's pretty amazing, honestly. Like, you'll get a lot of mileage out of it. Club Low, same thing. I think the game is like $7 or something on Steam. And that one's my favorite just because it embraces the ridiculousness. It's so vibrant. It's got these great music tracks. It just fully embraces risky, weird shit.
It's hard to make comedy. So much in my life, I need a moment where I can just sit down and enjoy something that makes me smile rather than something that makes me think. And so I very much can see why this would be the favorite.
The big takeaway here is this: indie games are thriving more than ever, and it's really cool to see them doing so well, especially in these micro niches like the narrative choice game. So, while the AAA gaming space continues to stagnate under the weight of its bloated budgets and franchise fatigue, smaller dev teams continue to innovate, making unique experiences and faithful spiritual successors that can still swing against the big boys when it comes to industry awards.
If you watched this far out on our little discussion today, we want to say thank you. This is a little bit of a departure from what we normally do for Backlog Quest, but I hope you enjoyed it. And also, if you'd like to help us out and encourage us to keep making these things, just like share it with a buddy. Maybe hit that button, whatever button you're staring at.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you hit that subscribe button and you hit the notification bell, you'll be warned when the next one of our videos drops, so you know exactly where not to click.
Or to click. Maybe you need a little smile in your day, or maybe you need a little think. Maybe you want to have a little think. Are we making people think? Well, probably not. But maybe we made them smile.
Anyway, hopefully we made you smile and think. If you're so inclined, please toss us a coin on our coffee page, and we'll see you on the next Two-Headed Hero.